China is moving to open its gates to travelers despite the increasing numbers of COVID cases. And the US shares its fears. World leaders, including the US, Japan, and EU members, are moving to impose sanctions and forbid their citizens from traveling to China. The tension is too high, and the global market can't bear any further falls and conflicts.
China is reopening again after years of COVID-19 restrictions. The country also announced it will drop quarantine requirements for international travelers.
This reopening for China has been the biggest step they've taken after almost 3 years of isolation.
In response, the US and several other countries want travelers from China to show a negative COVID-19 test before entering. That's because China is facing a huge wave of infections, hospitals are overcrowded, and major outbreaks are spreading across the country.
In this video, we will discuss the reasons why China is opening up to tourists, why the US is sanctioning the country, and its macroeconomic effects on the global health sector. But before moving on, don't forget to subscribe to Financial Countdown and ring the bell to be notified when new content comes out. China just switched from a zero-COVID policy to a completely relaxing policy. Last week, the Chinese government announced that it would open its borders to travelers by January 8, 2023, an announcement that most people believe is a bad move for the country, especially given the rising number of COVID cases. Meanwhile, we see a large movement, and big decisions are being made from the opposite camp. A virologist thinks that dropping quarantine overseas might cause the spread of new variants, and the 2 years' efforts will be in vain. It's not like early 2020 when COVID cases skyrocketed, yet the danger and the possibility of respreading remain high. People in China have been yearning to travel abroad after 3 years of isolation. By unbanning the flights,
Beijing removed almost all of its testing, lockdown, and quarantine measures, including on international travel. Starting January 8th, people traveling to China will only need to provide a negative COVID-19 test within 48 hours of arrival.
This is a big change from the last couple of years when it's been 14 or 21 days even of mandatory centralized quarantine.
But COVID-19 cases began to surge soon after restrictions were lifted, and many pharmacies in major cities ran low on medication. Scientists say it's easy for existing variants of the virus, like Omicron, to spread quickly in a place where few people had been previously infected.
the world will experience unusual travel movements, which could spark a new pandemic. The reaction from world leaders was unwelcoming and unsupportive. In fact, it was more of an aggressive reaction. The US, Japan, India, and Europe know that many travelers wish the country to reopen its borders. That includes students, family, friends, co-workers, and more. So imagine if we allowed all flights and trips to a country that's currently losing a battle against the COVID epidemic.
We'll continue to monitor the circumstances that are occurring in China and in other parts of the world as well as we do. We'll take the appropriate advice from the health experts and follow that advice. There's no change in the travel advice at this point in time.
Experts say the risk of a new strain developing in China is real, but standard COVID tests at airports aren't much use.
What we really need to do now is try and stop variants coming in, and that becomes much more difficult because the testing process for that is much more in-depth.
It's a tough one for Australian health authorities to weigh up. Next month, China celebrates the Lunar New Year. 4 years ago, before the pandemic, 7 million travellers from China went abroad, including thousands to Australia.
On top of that, China still suffers from an unstable social structure and angry groups, which increase security concerns. In fact, the decisions might lead to an increase in the variant COVID spread. And in light of the current shortage of antibiotics and other crucial medicines,
millions of them are desperate to get their hands on antiviral drugs as COVID infections in the country outpace the existing supplies. Naturally, this has caught China's hospitals, clinics, and pharmacies completely off guard. You see, they were unprepared for the onslaught of demand and gave little to no notice about stockpiling them. There was no heads up, no preparation. Their shelves have now gone empty.
The world simply can't afford to have that again. By unbanning overseas quarantine, the world will face a catastrophe, healthily, socially, and economically to a large degree. Last Tuesday, Japan announced that it would ban all flights to China. India did the same. And the United States made it clear that it would fight this decision. How is that a problem for the world in the eyes of the US, Europe, Japan, and India? 2 months ago, China implemented one of the most strict quarantines in its history.
The United States and the Philippines have said they're considering new coronavirus restrictions on travellers from China after Beijing announced it would reopen its borders next month. Japan, India and Malaysia have already said they'll tighten restrictions on arrivals from China amid concerns about a surge in cases and a lack of transparency from the Chinese government. Our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams reports.
From the world's most populous nation, alarming scenes. China's hospitals are overwhelmed, COVID infections soaring. The country's abrupt decision to dismantle much of its strict COVID regime apparently yielding terrifying results.
The zero COVID policy. However, when the going got tough, they quickly switched from a strict policy to a relaxed approach. It is the case that all these countries are fearing.
Outside this hospital in Chengdu, a queue for emergency services. Government officials say the situation is under control. That's not what these pictures suggest. At the Dongjiao funeral home, one of the city's biggest, more evidence of the scale of the crisis. One funeral procession after another. Workers here say they're so busy they have no time to eat. From 30 to 50 services a day, up to around 200. COVID mostly to blame.
And debating when to change their approach when they are experiencing an increase in COVID cases. Whatever Chinese officials say about this relaxed policy, the macro effects will be massive and life-changing. For better or worse, the days ahead will tell. Your opinion is very important to us. You can leave it in the comment box below this video. Thanks for watching.